forgotten I'm your mother?
We don't need you anymore, old woman. We have all your money already.
I need you to sit down for this one, because what I am about to tell you will shock you to your very bones. 3 months ago, I stood outside in a storm, clutching a soaked suitcase in my hands, while the mansion I built through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights became a prison that cast me out. My own children, the very ones I carried in my womb, nursed at my breast, and sacrificed everything for slammed the door in my face. And yet, here's the twist. Today, those same children are on their knees begging me to save them from the fire they set with their own hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Clara Johnson. I'm 62 years old, and I have lived a life most people would call extraordinary, though not for the reasons you might expect. For 43 years, I poured my heart, my health, and every ounce of strength into raising 3 children, Daniel, Sophia, and Eric. I gave them my all. My love, my labor, my youth. And in the end, they gave me betrayal so sharp it cut deeper than death itself. But before I take you to that rainy night when everything changed, you need to understand the woman I was, the road I walked, and the sacrifices that brought me to the fortune that became my curse. Now, before we go on, I want to ask you a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop your country in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Thank you. My name is Clara Johnson, and I was 39 years old when the ground beneath my life gave way. That was the year I buried my husband, Richard. A sudden heart attack took him from us, snatched away without warning, and left me with 3 young children staring up at me in confusion and fear. Daniel was 12, already tall for his age, and trying to act strong, though I could see the tears he fought to hide. Sophia was 9, her gentle hands clutching the hem of my dress as if holding me would somehow bring her father back. And Eric, my baby, had just turned 6. He was too young to understand death, but old enough to know something terrible had happened. That night, after we came home from the hospital, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of medical bills. They seemed endless, a mountain of debt stacked higher than any dream I'd ever dared to have. Our house was modest, 3 small bedrooms, a living room where the children had scattered their toys, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of Richard's favorite coffee. But even that home suddenly felt like it was slipping from my grasp. There was no savings, no nest egg, nothing but grief and responsibility pressing down on me like a boulder. I cried until I couldn't breathe, but when dawn came and I saw my children still sleeping, curled up together on the couch, I made myself a promise. I would not crumble. I would not let them see me broken. If Richard's death had left us with nothing, then I would build us something from scratch. I would hold this family together with my bare hands if I had to. Those early years were a blur of exhaustion and determination. My days started before the sun even thought of rising. At 5 o'clock sharp, I was scrubbing the floors of downtown office buildings. The smell of bleach clung to my hands, no matter how much soap I used, and the sound of my rags slapping against the tiles echoed in my dreams. Sometimes I would pause for a moment, kneeling on the cold floor and think, Clara, how did your life come to this? But then I'd remember the 3 little faces waiting at home, and the question would turn into resolve. By 8:30, I'd rush back home, sometimes with my knees still aching from the hours of bending and scrubbing. I'd shake the children awake, pack their lunches with whatever I could afford. Peanut butter sandwiches on good days, just bread and butter on the harder ones, and walk them to school. Daniel always walked a little ahead, pretending he wasn't scared, but I could see the way he glanced back at me every few steps, checking to make sure I was still there. Once the children were safely in class, I would hurry to my second job at the textile factory. The air there was thick with dust, and the machines rattled so loud I sometimes thought my ears would never know silence again. My hands grew calloused from handling fabric rolls, and my back ached from standing 12 hours at a time. Still, I worked. Every paycheck meant another bill paid, another week of food on the table. By 3 o'clock, I was back at the school gates to collect my children. I never wanted them to come home to an empty house. I wanted them to see my face, to know that no matter how hard the world was, their mother would always show up. We'd walk home together, and on the way, they'd chatter about their day. Sophia telling me about a song she learned in music class, Eric showing me a drawing he made, Daniel keeping quiet but squeezing my hand just a little tighter. Those walks were my joy, the tiny reward that made the blisters on my feet worth it. Evenings were another battle. I'd cook dinner, beans and rice most nights, chicken only when I could stretch the budget. We'd eat together at the small kitchen table, and I insisted on saying grace before every meal. We must always thank God, I'd remind them, not for what we lack, but for what we have. After dinner, I'd help them with homework. Daniel would groan over his math problems, Sophia would write carefully in her notebook, and Eric would curl up next to me, pretending to study while slowly drifting to sleep. At 7:30, I'd tuck them into bed, kiss each forehead, and whisper promises I wasn't sure I could keep. One day, all this will change. One day, Mom will give you the life you deserve. Then I'd put on a fresh apron and leave for my night shift at the diner. The diner was another world entirely. Bright lights, clinking glasses, laughter of strangers who had no idea that the woman pouring their coffee hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days. I smiled and served, even when my legs throbbed and my arms shook from fatigue. Tips were small, but I saved every penny in an old jar hidden in the pantry. That jar was my lifeline, my silent partner in the fight for survival. By the time I stumbled back home after 11, the children were fast asleep. I'd slip quietly into their rooms, pull the blankets up around their shoulders, and stand there watching them breathe. Sometimes I'd kneel by their beds and cry silently so they wouldn't hear. Then I'd collapse into my own bed for a few precious hours of rest before the cycle started all over again. Weekends were no easier. While other families went to picnics or slept in, mine was a battlefield of chores and survival. Saturday mornings meant laundry, buckets of water, soap scrubbing until my knuckles burned. Groceries followed, where I learned to stretch a dollar further than most people thought possible. Church on Sundays gave me strength, but even then, I couldn't rest. Wealthy families across town often hired me to cater their gatherings, and I took every opportunity. I'd cook meals fit for kings, while praying that one day I'd be able to afford even half those ingredients for my own children. There was no such thing as leisure in my life, but there were moments of grace. The way Sophia sang while washing dishes, her voice so pure it lifted the weight from my shoulders. The way Eric's laughter filled the room even when I thought I had nothing left to give. And Daniel, though quiet, once slipped a folded note into my pocket. It said simply, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll help you one day." That note, crumpled and worn, stayed with me for years, a reminder that my sacrifices were not invisible. When I look back at those years, I sometimes wonder how my body managed to keep moving. Fatigue lived in my bones like an unwelcome tenant. My knees ached constantly, my fingers cracked and bled from endless scrubbing and stitching, and my back felt as though it carried the weight of the world. But I learned early on that pain does not excuse you from duty. Duty keeps going, no matter how broken you feel. I remember one winter that nearly crushed me. The furnace in our little house broke down, and we didn't have the money to repair it. The nights dropped below freezing, and the children shivered under thin blankets. I gave them my own coat to share, piling it over their small bodies while I stayed awake by the stove, feeding it scraps of wood just to keep a little heat alive. My hands blistered from the cold, and my breath fogged the air inside our kitchen, but I would have frozen solid before I let those children suffer alone. That same winter, I skipped meals more often than I can count. Daniel grew taller, hungrier, his appetite stretching far beyond what I could afford. Sophia had a sweet tooth, always asking for fruit or honey, and Eric wanted meat on his plate like the other boys at school. I made sure their bellies were full, even if it meant mine remained empty. I learned to chew gum or sip hot water to trick my stomach into thinking it had something in it. I never told them. Children don't need to know the full cost of a mother's sacrifice. There was a woman on our street, Miss Helen, who lived alone after her husband passed. She was well into her 70s, with legs too weak to carry groceries and eyes too dim to read medicine labels. Despite my own exhaustion, I often checked on her. I carried her shopping bags, shoveled snow from her porch, and sat with her when the loneliness pressed in too heavily. Some neighbors said I was foolish to waste time helping when I could barely manage my own life, but I couldn't turn away. Kindness was not a luxury, it was a responsibility. I wanted my children to see that. I wanted them to understand that even in hardship, we can still give. Sophia especially seemed to take notice. One Saturday, she came with me to Miss Helen's and helped tidy the kitchen. When we left, she slipped her small hand into mine and whispered, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to help people too." Those words kept me warm in a way no furnace ever could. The factory was its own kind of trial. The noise of the looms was deafening, a constant roar that never left your ears. I carried that ringing home at night, the sound following me into dreams. The air was thick with fibers that stuck to our clothes, our hair, even our lungs. Many women coughed endlessly, their chests rattling like broken engines. I worried for my health, but I told myself I had no choice. Each paycheck was survival, and survival was non-negotiable. One afternoon, while stacking bolts of fabric, I sliced my palm open on a jagged edge of metal. The wound bled heavily, soaking through the rag I wrapped around it. My supervisor told me to take the rest of the day off, but when I thought of the bills waiting at home, I shook my head and went back to work. I pressed the cloth tighter, ignored the sting, and kept moving until my legs nearly gave out. That scar remains with me even now, a faint line across my palm, a reminder that my body has always been the currency I paid in. The diner nights were another story entirely. I wore a forced smile as men in suits barked for more coffee and teenagers laughed too loudly in the corner booths. I balanced trays so heavy they left bruises on my forearms, and I endured the sting of being invisible, just another tired waitress who didn't matter to the world. But those tips, no matter how small, filled the jar at home. I told myself each dollar was a stepping stone, each coin a brick in the foundation of a future where my children would never know this kind of struggle. Sometimes I'd return home past midnight and find the children asleep on the couch, books and pencils scattered around them. They had tried to wait up for me. Daniel would often leave the lamp on as if to guide me back safely. I would switch it off, cover them with blankets, and whisper into the dark, "Mom's here now. Rest easy." There were moments of light among the shadows. Daniel once surprised me by fixing the broken faucet with nothing but an old wrench and instructions from a library book. Sophia saved pennies from her school allowance to buy me a pair of gloves when my hands cracked in the cold. Eric, my baby, would sneak drawings into my purse, stick figures of us holding hands, surrounded by hearts and sunshine. These small gestures reminded me that love was still alive in our home, even when money wasn't. But I would be lying if I said I never felt despair. Some nights, after the children were asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the stack of bills, the jar of coins, and the dark window where my reflection looked like a stranger. I would clutch Richard's old photograph, whispering into the silence, "I'm trying, love. I'm trying so hard." The house was too quiet in those moments, the kind of silence that made your chest ache. Yet every dawn I rose again. My body screamed for rest, but my spirit forced me forward. I told myself that all this suffering had to lead somewhere. I believed with every fiber of my being that if I just kept pushing, if I just endured, one day the tide would turn. My children would walk into a life brighter than mine had ever been. That was the dream I carried, heavier than any suitcase, stronger than any storm. There's something people rarely admit about survival. It strips you of vanity. I learned quickly that I couldn't afford pride. I wore the same pair of shoes until the soles thinned to nothing. I stitched my dresses again and again until the fabric was more patched than cloth. I cut my own hair over the bathroom sink, standing on a towel while Sophia held the mirror for me, giggling when my bangs came out uneven. To anyone else it might have looked pitiful, but to us it was life, and we laughed because laughter was free. The neighbors noticed my grind, though not always with kindness. Some whispered that I worked too much, that my children would grow up resenting me for always being gone. Others pitied me in silence, offering sideways glances when I walked home with groceries balanced on each arm. I let them talk. None of them saw the way my children's eyes lit up when I scraped together enough money for birthday cakes, or the joy in their laughter when we huddled around the radio, listening to gospel songs before bed. They didn't see that love was present in my house, even if money was not. I also refused to let poverty rob my children of dignity. Every morning, no matter how tired I was, I pressed their clothes with an iron I bought secondhand. I polished their shoes until they shone. They might not have the fanciest things, but they walked into school clean, neat, and proud. I wanted them to understand that respectability was not bought with wealth, but earned through how you carried yourself. Sundays were sacred. No matter how heavy my week had been, I dressed my children for church. We didn't sit in the front pews. We couldn't afford to tithe like the wealthier families, but we sang the hymns louder than anyone else. I clutched my children's hands as we prayed, thanking God not for abundance, but for endurance. Faith was the thread that held me together when everything else seemed to unravel. One particular Sunday stays etched in my memory. After service, a woman pulled me aside. She was well-dressed, her perfume lingering even in the cold air. She pressed a small envelope into my hand and said, "For the children." I opened it later at home to find $50 inside, more than I earned in a week at the factory. I cried that night, not just for the money, but for the reminder that sometimes kindness appears when you least expect it. Still, most days we had no help but our own determination. Daniel took small jobs mowing lawns and carrying groceries for neighbors, handing me every dime he earned. Sophia cleaned chalkboards after school for a teacher who slipped her cookies in return. Eric collected bottles to exchange for coins, running home proudly with his pockets jingling. I told them they didn't have to, but they insisted. Even as children, they wanted to carry the load with me. That's what made those years bearable, knowing that despite our struggles, we were united. At night, when the house was finally quiet, I sometimes sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, scribbling numbers in the dim light. Rent, utilities, food, school supplies. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. I wasn't educated in finance, but hardship is its own kind of classroom. I became an expert at stretching money until it squealed. I clipped coupons, bargained at markets, and learned which grocers would quietly hand me bruised fruit for free. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Of course, there were humiliations I kept hidden from my children. There were nights I stood in the corner of the pawn shop, sliding off my wedding ring just to cover a hospital bill. Days when I swallowed my pride and borrowed bus fare from strangers. Evenings when I ate scraps left at the diner, pretending to the children that I'd already eaten earlier. I bore those shames alone, because their innocence was the only treasure I had left, and I refused to let hardship steal it. But for every wound poverty dealt me, there were small victories that stitched me back together. Like the time Eric won a ribbon for a drawing contest, and he stood on that stage with a grin wide enough to light the whole auditorium. Or when Sophia's teacher told me she had a voice like an angel, and I nearly burst with pride. Or the day Daniel came home with top marks in his class, quietly laying the paper on the table without a word, but his eyes shining with the pride he didn't want to admit. Those moments kept me alive. They were proof that my sacrifices weren't in vain. Sometimes, late at night, I spoke aloud to Richard's photograph. "We're still standing," I'd whisper. "The children are growing strong. I wish you could see them." His absence was a wound that never healed, but in the silence, I imagined he was listening, cheering us on from a place I could not see. Looking back now, I realize those years forged something in me that no money could ever buy. Strength, grit, and an unshakable will. I was a woman tempered in fire, and my children were my reason to endure every flame. And yet, as I tell you this story today, I cannot help but wonder, did I give them so much that I blinded them to the value of sacrifice itself? Did I protect them so fiercely from suffering that they grew blind to compassion? I didn't know it then. At that time, all I knew was that every drop of sweat, every blister, every sleepless night would one day bear fruit. I clung to that belief like a lifeline, and for a while, it seemed I was right. Have you ever been so broke that the smell of someone else's food felt like an insult? That was me once, walking past restaurants with my stomach twisting, telling my children we had already eaten, when in truth there was nothing waiting at home. And yet, those same kitchens I once envied became the very door God used to open my way. My story of success didn't begin in a boardroom or with investors writing big checks. It began with me chopping onions in a stranger's kitchen, praying I wouldn't cry more tears into the stew than the onions themselves caused. The first chance came on a Sunday afternoon. A neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, had heard about the way I cooked during church gatherings. "Clara," she said, "my niece is getting married, and I can't handle all that cooking alone. Will you help me? I'll pay." It wasn't much, just a handful of bills folded into her palm, but it felt like someone had handed me the key to another life. I cooked like my soul was on the line, seasoning each dish with the love I once gave to my husband and the hope I now clung to for my children. That day, I discovered something. When you pour yourself fully into your work, people notice. The guests raved about the food, and Mrs. Lopez kept pulling me aside, whispering, "They love it, Clara. They keep asking who made it." By the end of the night, 3 different women slipped me their numbers and asked if I could cook for their family events. My hands ached, my feet were blistered, but my heart beat with a fire I hadn't felt in years. From that one wedding, the calls started coming. A birthday here, a church function there, then a graduation party. I was still working at the factory and diner, but slowly, the catering began to feel like more than just extra income. It was a spark. Each event brought new faces, new compliments, and new possibilities. And my children, they saw me differently. No longer just mom, the exhausted widow juggling 3 jobs. They saw me as a woman creating something bigger, something that belonged to us. Daniel was the first to really grasp it. One night, he came into the kitchen where I was stirring a giant pot, sweat dripping from my brow. "Mom," he said, "you don't look tired anymore. You look alive." I laughed, wiping my face with the corner of my apron. "Alive, huh? Maybe that's what purpose does to a person." He smiled, that serious smile of his, the one that made him seem older than his years. "One day you're going to have your own place. I can see it." At the time, I brushed it off as a child's dream. But deep inside, his words planted a seed. The real test came when I was asked to cater for a corporate luncheon. It was my biggest order yet, triple the size of anything I had ever handled. For 2 days, I barely slept, chopping, stirring, and preparing. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, writing labels for the trays in her neat handwriting. Eric helped carry supplies, sometimes spilling things and making me laugh despite the chaos. We turned our tiny kitchen into a production line, and when I delivered the food on that fateful afternoon, I felt like I was walking into an exam I hadn't studied for. But it worked. The clients loved it, and more importantly, they kept my number. That was when I realized this wasn't just survival anymore. It was the start of a business. I began investing the little profit I made back into supplies. Stronger pans, sturdier trays. A second-hand van that rattled so much the kids nicknamed it the Thunder Wagon. I started keeping detailed notes of every expense, every profit, teaching myself how to run numbers late into the night. There were no investors, no fancy advisors, just me, my pen, and the determination to never go back to the days when hunger gnawed at us like a beast. The breakthrough came with another wedding. A wealthy family in town had heard about that widow who cooks like she's feeding angels. When I walked into their estate, I felt like a fish out of water. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, the floors gleamed, and I kept thinking, what am I doing here? But once I put on my apron and began working, all doubt melted away. I cooked as if my life depended on it. And in a way, it did. By the end of the night, the bride's father handed me an envelope thicker than any I'd ever received. "You have talent," he said firmly. "Don't waste it in other people's kitchens. Build your own." That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed, staring at the envelope. The money inside wasn't enough to change our lives overnight, but the words, the affirmation, felt like permission to dream bigger. And so I dared. It took 2 years of non-stop work, saving every spare penny, saying no to anything that wasn't essential. I mended my children's clothes instead of buying new ones. I patched my shoes until the soles nearly gave way. I cut corners in every area of life so I could pour into this one dream, opening a restaurant. When the day finally came, I signed a lease on a modest space downtown. The building was old, with cracked tiles and peeling paint, but when I walked in, I saw something different. I saw families gathered at tables. I saw laughter. I saw birthdays and anniversaries celebrated with meals made from my hands. It wasn't just a restaurant to me, it was a vision of a better future. I named it Clara's Place. The first few weeks nearly broke me. Some nights no one showed up. I would sit in the back, head in my hands, whispering prayers into the silence. But then a customer would return, bringing friends. Word spread. Soon, the tables began to fill. The same families who had once hired me for catering now sat in my restaurant, smiling, eating, and telling others. The pride in my children's eyes carried me through. Daniel, already deep in his studies, would come by and review contracts for me, making sure no one cheated me. Sophia sang to the customers sometimes when the nights grew long, her voice filling the room with beauty that made people linger just a little longer. Eric, always full of energy, helped with small tasks, learning the ropes of responsibility. It wasn't just my restaurant, it was our place. Every milestone felt like a miracle. The first time we broke even, the first time we made a profit, the first review in the local paper that called Clara's Place a gem of the city. Each step forward was proof that all the suffering hadn't been in vain. And yet, I didn't let pride blind me. I knew success could vanish as quickly as it came. So I stayed humble, kept working, and thanked God every night for another chance to provide for my family. The first restaurant gave me confidence, but it also gave me a vision. If one location could bring people together, why not two? Why not three? Expanding wasn't easy. Banks didn't line up to hand loans to a widowed black woman with no business degree. More than once, I walked out of offices with tears stinging my eyes after hearing, "We're not sure you can handle this kind of responsibility." But I refused to let their doubt become my truth. I tightened my budget, reinvested every dollar of profit, and leaned on the loyalty of customers who had become more like family. One evening, after months of planning, I opened my second restaurant across town. The night was packed. People lined up outside the door, eager to taste the food they'd heard about from friends and neighbors. My hands shook as I moved between tables, making sure everything ran smoothly. But by the end of the night, exhaustion gave way to joy. We had done it again. From there, momentum carried me forward. A third location followed, then a fourth. Each opening stretched me thin, but it also grew my faith in what was possible. I learned to hire managers I could trust, to train staff not just to serve food, but to serve kindness. I wanted every customer to feel what I had always poured into my cooking: care, dignity, and love. My children grew alongside my business. Daniel, the eldest, threw himself into law with a discipline that reminded me so much of his father. I remember the day he walked across the stage at his graduation, tall and proud in his gown, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on me. "We did it, Mom," he whispered when I hugged him afterward. "Not I, but we." He never forgot where he came from, and I never stopped reminding him that his success was the fruit of both our sacrifices. Sophia, my middle child, carried music in her bones. From the time she was little, she would hum tunes while helping me in the kitchen. As she grew, that talent blossomed into something extraordinary. She played piano at church, wrote songs late into the night, and by her 20s, she was performing on stages that once felt out of reach for a girl from our neighborhood. I still remember sitting in the front row at her first real concert, tears streaming down my face as I thought, "Richard, our baby girl made it." Eric, my youngest, had a different path. Sports were his language: basketball, football, anything that got him moving. But beyond the courts and fields, he had a heart for people. He started volunteering with local youth programs, mentoring kids who reminded him of himself. "Mom," he told me once, "if I can keep even one kid off the streets, that's a win." Hearing those words filled me with more pride than any trophy could. As their lives blossomed, mine reached heights I had never imagined. At 55, I received an offer to sell the restaurant chain. $35 million. I nearly dropped the phone when I heard it. My hands trembled as I called Daniel to review the contract. He combed through every page, nodding slowly before saying, "Mom, this is it. You've built something incredible. This is your reward." The day I signed the papers, I sat alone in my office for a long time. The weight of that pen in my hand felt heavier than any tray I had ever carried. I thought of my husband and the life we had dreamed of together before it was cut short. I thought of nights spent scrubbing offices, of mornings dragging myself to the factory, of evenings at the diner, and of the endless meals cooked in kitchens that weren't my own. And then I thought of my children, educated, talented, compassionate, standing tall on the foundation I had bled for. When the wire transfer cleared, my accounts showed numbers I had never dared imagine. $35 million from the sale, plus years of savings, investments, and properties. Altogether, $50 million. Me. Clara Johnson. A girl who once counted coins at the grocery store to see if she could afford bread and milk. A widow who had buried her husband at 39 and promised her children they would never be abandoned, no matter the cost. I wept that day. Not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude that God had carried me through when I had nothing. Gratitude that my children had seen the example of perseverance. Gratitude that the road of struggle had led to a mountaintop I had never thought I'd climb. People often ask me what success feels like. To me, it wasn't the money sitting in the bank or the contracts signed with powerful men in tailored suits. Success was walking into one of my restaurants and seeing a young couple holding hands over dinner. It was watching Sophia play piano for a crowd. It was Eric bringing a group of kids into the gym to keep them off the streets. It was Daniel looking me in the eye and saying, "Mom, you taught me how to fight for my dreams." Yes, the fortune gave us comfort. Yes, it changed our lives. But the true wealth was knowing I had built something that mattered. Something that proved that even in the face of loss, even when the world says no, a woman's determination can build an empire from nothing. If only I had known then what that empire would one day cost me. There's something sacred about Sunday dinner. For me, it had always been more than just food on the table. It was survival. It was unity. It was love served in ladles and spoons. Back in the hardest days, when Richard had just passed and the bills stacked higher than the hope in my heart, I would stretch one meal into many. I'd stand in the kitchen, hands trembling with exhaustion, and find a way to make a single pot feed 4 hungry mouths. Somehow, no matter how thin the soup or how small the roast, I made it stretch. And the children, God bless them, they never complained. Now, decades later, I found myself standing in that same kitchen, preparing a meal that carried memories in every aroma. The house was larger, the counters polished granite instead of scratched linoleum, but the heart of the moment was the same. I seasoned the food slowly, with care, knowing this night was not just about eating together. It was about closing one chapter of my life and opening another for my children. The table was set with linen napkins and my best china. Candles flickered in the center, their glow bouncing softly against the walls. I wanted the atmosphere to feel familiar, yet elevated, a bridge between the days when we had nothing and the life we now lived with abundance. One by one, they arrived. Daniel was first, punctual as always, his suit jacket draped neatly over his arm, his law books still tucked in a bag he carried everywhere. Sophia swept in next, her laughter filling the room before she even crossed the threshold, her perfume trailing like a song. Eric came last, casual and energetic, hugging me tight and asking if he could sneak a bite before we sat down. We gathered around the table, the clinking of cutlery and the soft hum of conversation wrapping us in a cocoon of family. For a moment, I let myself drift back in time. I saw Richard at the head of a much smaller table, carving meat with steady hands, smiling at the children as though his entire world sat on those chairs. My heart ached, but also swelled. He wasn't here to see this night, yet I knew he was proud. After plates were filled and the first bites taken, I cleared my throat. The chatter quieted, and 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My children, grown but still carrying the features of the babies I once held close. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my fork. "There's something I want to share with you," I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of years. "You know how much I've worked, how much we've all sacrificed to get here. The restaurants, the long nights, the days of doubt, all of it was for this family, for you. And now, I believe it's time for me to pass on what I've built." Sophia leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity. Daniel straightened, sensing the seriousness of my tone. Eric froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. I've arranged trusts, I continued, for each of you. $50 million divided evenly. That means each of you will receive about $16.5 million. The silence that followed was heavy, as though the room itself had paused to take in the enormity of what I had just said. Then, like sparks igniting dry wood, their reactions flared. Daniel spoke first, his voice measured, but unable to hide the flicker of excitement. Mom, this changes everything. I've been wanting to expand the firm, take on more cases, build a practice that can really compete on a national level. With this, I could open offices in new cities, hire the kind of lawyers who could put us on the map. We wouldn't just be a small firm anymore, we'd be a powerhouse. His eyes gleamed with ambition, the same intensity that had driven him since childhood. Sophia clasped her hands together, her face glowing as if she had just stepped into a spotlight. Mom, you don't know what this means for me. I've always wanted to record an album with a full orchestra, to bring my music to life on the grandest scale. I can finally commission the work, hire the best producers, and even build a platform to share my music with the world. I'll host concerts, maybe even travel. People will finally see me, not just as a performer, but as an artist who can leave her mark. Eric leaned back in his chair, his grin stretching from ear to ear. Mom, I've been dreaming about opening a youth center. Not just a small one, but a network of them across the city. Places where kids can play ball, get tutoring, find mentors. Everything I wish I had when I was younger. With this money, I can make it real. I can hire staff, build safe spaces, and maybe even expand beyond our city one day. This is bigger than me. It's about changing lives. I listened, my heart swelling with pride as each of my children laid out their dreams. They weren't thinking small. They were thinking bold, as if the chains of scarcity that had bound us for so long had finally shattered. For years, I had carried the weight of providing, of ensuring they had a chance at life. Now, here they were, ready to carry that weight themselves, to build on the foundation I had laid. As they spoke, I caught glimpses of the children they had once been. Daniel, the boy who had stayed up late, helping me tally numbers when I was too tired to see straight, now envisioning himself as a leader in law. Sophia, the little girl who once hummed songs while stirring a pot at my side, now dreaming of filling concert halls with her music. Eric, the energetic child who had dribbled a ball through the cramped living room, now imagining gyms and classrooms for the next generation. I closed my eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer of thanks. Richard, I thought, we did it. They're ready. Dinner stretched on, filled with laughter and plans. Daniel asked me about legal structures, Sophia about industry contacts, Eric about nonprofit funding models. I answered what I could, but mostly I listened. It was their turn to take the stage, to imagine futures that stretched far beyond what I had once dared to dream. When dessert was finished and the plates were cleared, I sat back and looked at them, really looked. My children, no longer children, but adults poised to step into lives of their own making. I felt something inside me settle, a deep peace I hadn't known in years. My life's work, I told them softly, is complete. I can leave this world tomorrow, knowing I've given you everything I had to give. Their eyes softened, and for a moment I saw love, gratitude, and unity shining across the table. It was the perfect ending to decades of struggle, the culmination of sacrifice, perseverance, and faith. But even as I sat there basking in that fleeting harmony, a shadow crossed my heart. Perhaps it was intuition, or perhaps it was the wisdom of a woman who had weathered too many storms. Because while I saw joy in their faces, I also glimpsed something else, ambition sharp enough to cut, dreams heavy enough to weigh them down, desires strong enough to clash. If I had known what this money would do to them, I might have hesitated. If I had known the way their laughter that night would turn to arguments, the way their unity would splinter into rivalry, the way their eyes, once filled with love, would harden into something colder, I might have chosen differently. But in that moment, as candles flickered low and the warmth of family wrapped around me like a blanket, I believed. I believed in their goodness, in their strength, in the love that had carried us this far. The first sign was so small I almost missed it. A call that used to last 20 minutes ended in 5. Daniel said he had a meeting starting in 2. and before I could reply, I was listening to a dial tone. I stood there with the phone still against my ear, staring at the kitchen clock. I told myself not to read into it. Lawyers are busy, calendars get tight, and success always comes with noise. Still, the quiet that followed felt louder than it should have. The next week, Sophia texted me instead of calling. "Hey Mom, can't make dinner Sunday. Rehearsal ran late, and I'm wiped. Rain check?" I typed and deleted 3 different responses, then settled on a cheerful reply with a heart I didn't quite feel. She sent a quick love you and a string of music notes. When Sunday came, her chair looked taller and emptier than I remembered. I put her napkin back in the drawer and told myself she would come next time. Eric still popped in, though increasingly with Tanya on his arm. He used to sit at the counter telling me about the kids he coached, tapping his foot while he talked, as if the stories couldn't get out fast enough. Now, he drifted in behind Tanya's perfume, eyes on his phone, nodding at jokes he didn't hear. When I asked about his week, he smiled without showing teeth and said, "Good, Mom, the way people answer strangers in elevators." I tried to read his face for something deeper, but he was already glancing toward Tanya to see if she approved of whatever he just said. Tanya had a way of moving through my house as if it were a showroom in need of rearranging. The first Sunday she joined us, she greeted me with a hug that landed on my shoulders rather than my heart. "This place is so cozy," she said, pausing just long enough on the word to turn it into something else. She ran her fingers along the mantel, then suggested I lighten the walls. "Soft white would photograph better," she added lightly as if mentioning the weather. I smiled and offered her tea. At dinner, she commented on everything in the tone of someone correcting a student. My choice of flowers, the shape of the glasses, the lighting. "You'd be surprised what a dimmer switch can do," she said, placing her linen napkin just so. Eric laughed, eager, and reached for the bread. I noticed he waited to see whether she'd buttered hers before he touched his. It was a small thing, barely a moment, but it lodged itself under my ribs. Daniel became efficient with me, polite, punctual, and clipped. When he stopped by, he never sat for long. He'd stand near the doorway like a guest who wasn't sure he should take off his coat. "I can only stay a minute," he'd say, glancing at his watch. He started sending assistants to handle paperwork I would normally ask him about. One assistant called me "ma'am" twice in a single sentence, each "ma'am" laying a brick in a wall I had not agreed to build. Daniel didn't notice. Or he did, and decided it wasn't worth noticing. Sophia's world lifted itself on tiptoe and floated upward, out of reach. Her fiancé, a tall man who spoke in polished paragraphs, liked to mention which gallery openings they'd attended, which hotels made proper espresso, which charity committees were worth their time. He called my neighborhood transitional and my silverware vintage in a charming way. He asked Daniel where he got his suits, in a tone that sounded like a compliment and felt like an audit. Later, when I served dessert, he explained to me how certain toppings were done in certain cities. A tutorial I had not requested. Sophia smiled at him as if he had just recited a poem. The calls continued to shrink. "I'm hopping into a car, Mom," Daniel would say. "Can we circle back?" We never circled back. Sophia's messages slid into my phone like press releases, short, glossy, and safe. "Quick update. We added a second date to the show. We'll send tickets soon." "Proud of us." I typed "proud of you" and stared at the screen, my own reflection dim beneath the words. Eric's contact photo lit up less often. More messages came from Tanya, confirming plans in a voice that made everything sound like a meeting. "We can do 7:30 Sunday pending any conflicts." Pending. As if our table were an item on someone else's agenda. When we did gather, the rhythm felt off, like a song played half a beat too fast. Daniel corrected my pronunciation of a designer's name I hadn't tried to pronounce. Sophia told a story about a reception and glanced at her fiancé for permission to laugh. Eric scrolled while he chewed. Tanya laughed at something on his screen and rotated it toward me as if I should recognize the person photographed beside her. "Everyone uses this place now," she said, naming a restaurant where the waiters knew your name before you sat down. I nodded and asked if they wanted more greens. They complimented my cooking the way people compliment the weather, pleasantly and from a distance. "This is great, Mom," Daniel said, tapping a fork twice against his plate. His eyes had the faraway look of someone already drafting sentences in his head. Lovely spread, Sophia's fiancé added, as if he were writing a review. Tanya said the table was intimate, then recommended a company that would refresh my entertaining aesthetic. I pictured my grandmother's hands on a table like this one, passing platters with her wrists turned up, and decided not to hire anyone. I will admit something. I tried to make up for the drift with effort. I ironed the napkins until the creases were as sharp as paper cuts. I placed the candles as if angles could fix what angles could not. I printed menus because someone once told me that's what people do now. The children smiled and took photos. Tanya angled her plate and adjusted the flowers so the arrangement read better. Sophia's fiancé suggested a lower centerpiece next time for sightlines, the phrase floating over my table like a cloud I hadn't invited. I told myself it was a phase. Adults change, schedules swell, circles widen. Isn't that what I wanted? To see them lifted by their own momentum? So I took their rain checks, polished the silver, and moved the dinner time later to accommodate rehearsals and after-hours meetings. I added one more chair for whatever friend or advisor might be in town for the weekend. The house swallowed the extra laughter politely and then returned to quiet when the door closed behind them. There were other signs, pinpricks that accumulated until they formed a constellation. Daniel started saying we when he meant his firm, a small shift that relocated his center of gravity by a few degrees. We're setting policy internally, he said one afternoon when I asked about a case. We're branding more aggressively. He stopped asking my opinion on anything that wasn't pleasant. When I gave it anyway, he listened the way one listens to a radio while searching for another station. Sophia's calendar became a geography lesson. This city, that city, the whisper of a continent I had never visited. She joked that I should come along one day, then asked if my passport was current in a tone that was less invitation than observation. We'll see, she said, already moving on to the next thing. I told her to send me a recording of the new piece. She posted a photograph of herself rehearsing instead, a caption thanking sponsors and tagging names I didn't recognize. The comments were full of hearts and declarations from strangers who said they loved her. I loved her too. I just didn't say it in the right place. Eric began carrying tension in his jaw, the way people do when they are working harder to appear relaxed than to be it. When I asked about the youth program, he said, "It's fine," in a voice that closed the subject. Tanya always had more detail than he did. She described branding partners and potential expansions, a language of ladders and logos. She talked about optics and deliverables, while Eric nodded. Sometimes he would glance at me when she wasn't looking, and for a second, I saw the boy who used to fold paper airplanes at the kitchen table. Then Tanya would touch his arm and he'd look away. I noticed how their gifts changed. They had always brought thoughtful little things on Sundays, tea from a place that reminded them of me, a book with pages marked, a picture frame they'd already filled. Now the gifts were grand and impersonal, the kind people give when they want you to be impressed rather than known. An oversized floral arrangement arrived one weekday morning with a card that read, "For the best mom," in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I took a photo and sent a thank you. The reply was a heart from Tanya. One evening, Daniel called while walking somewhere windy. I could hear traffic and the muffled echo of his shoes on concrete. "Quick check-in," he said. "You good? Need anything?" I said I was fine and asked if he was eating properly. "Mom," he laughed, kind but not present. "We have people for that." "We." People. A gentle fence erected in 12 words. Sophia's fiancé started arriving without Sophia if she was delayed. He would stand in my foyer and give me status updates, how her rehearsal ran, who was in the room, who wasn't. He asked about my week the way one asks a neighbor in passing. When Sophia finally joined, she kissed my cheek and exaggerated a sigh. "You know how it is, Mom," she said, shrugging at the air. I looked at her and thought, I do know how it is. I just don't know how you are. Tanya developed a habit of recommending professionals, a stylist who could elevate my look for photographs I did not intend to take, a florist who understood scale, an organizer who could maximize flow. She offered these names like favors, each card placed on the edge of my counter as if my home were a project waiting for approval. I thanked her and put the cards in a drawer that stayed closed. At night, I walked the upstairs hall and listened to the house breathe. My footsteps echoed against polished wood. Once, while changing a light bulb, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and didn't recognize my own posture. I was standing the way people stand in museums, hands folded, voice low, careful not to touch anything. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to cling. I told myself the truth can be simple and benign. People grow, lives expand, traditions bend. So I moderated my questions, tucked my worries behind a hostess smile, and set one more place at the table. Then, on a damp Sunday that smelled like stone and rain, they all arrived at once, but not quite together. 3 separate cars, 3 separate clocks. Daniel took a call on the porch before he came in, nodding to no one. Sophia kissed the air beside my cheek and complimented a painting she hadn't noticed before. Eric hugged me with one arm, the other wrapped around Tanya's waist. While I carried dishes to the table, Tanya rearranged the centerpiece and turned the lights down 2 clicks. "Much better," she said, as if this were a studio and we were preparing a set. We sat. Conversation skimmed the surface, bright and untroubled. Daniel shared a sanitized work story that had no people in it, only outcomes. Sophia described a reception in a way that sounded like a map: location, names, exits. Eric said he was busy, then showed me a post about the program where he stood half a step behind Tanya, smiling like a guest. I reached for the bread and tried to catch his eye. He smiled back, quick and unsteady, then looked down. Halfway through the meal, Tanya complimented a serving dish and asked if it was original to the house, a phrase that made me feel like a piece of furniture. Sophia's fiancé talked about guest lists. Daniel checked his watch. Noise rose and fell like the ocean, never reaching shore. I passed the bowl, nodded at the right moments, and let their words pass through me the way wind passes through lace, touching everything, holding nothing. When they left, the house returned to itself in a single breath. I stacked plates slowly, listening to the dim ring of china, the soft thud of drawers. In the sink, a spoon knocked against porcelain, twice, like a heartbeat trying to keep time. I wiped the table and smoothed the runner with my palm until the fabric lay perfectly flat. Then I turned off the dining room lamp and stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "It's a phase," I whispered into the quiet. "They're finding their pace, let them run." I believed myself for almost a minute. Then the clock in the hallway chimed, and the sound seemed to come from far away, as if it belonged to someone else's evening. I walked upstairs, touching the banister Richard once varnished with careful hands, and told the echoing rooms good night. The next morning, my phone lit up with a calendar invite from Tanya. Sunday, tentative, will confirm. Beneath it, Sophia's message, flying out after the show, might miss dinner. Rain check? An hour later, Daniel's assistant wrote, "Mr. Johnson can do 15 minutes by phone Monday afternoon." I looked at the 3 notes together and realized they fit like puzzle pieces. When I placed them side by side, they formed a picture I didn't want to name. I brewed coffee and stood at the window while steam rose from the cup. Outside, the street looked exactly as it had the day before. Trees still, neighbors walking dogs, the same delivery truck stopping at the same house. Inside, something had shifted. Not a crash, not a break, just a slow tilt, the kind you don't notice until a glass begins to slide. I took a sip, set the cup down, and opened the drawer where I'd tucked the stack of business cards Tanya had left. I closed it again without taking anything out. Then I set 4 plates in the cabinet where I'd always kept them and left a space for a 5th I wasn't sure would be used. "It's a phase," I said again. The house did not disagree. It simply held its breath and waited. It didn't happen in an instant. The change crept in slowly, like rust eating away at metal, until one day I realized my children were no longer standing beside me. They were standing above me, looking down. Daniel was the first to show it. For as long as I could remember, our home had been anchored by familiar faces. Gloria, who had cleaned for me since the days when I juggled 3 jobs, and Mr. Thomas, the handyman who fixed more than leaky faucets. He mended spirits with his steady presence. They weren't staff, they were family. But Daniel called me into his office one afternoon. He didn't even sit me at his desk. He stood by the window, his tone clipped as if presenting to a client. "Mom, it's time to professionalize. Gloria, Thomas, the others. They're outdated. Sentimentality doesn't equal efficiency. I've already arranged severance." My mouth went dry. "Daniel, they raised you. Gloria held you when you cried. Mr. Thomas taught you how to swing a hammer." He sighed, eyes hard. "This isn't about childhood memories. This is about running a family the right way." And just like that, they were gone. The house felt emptier, colder, staffed by strangers who called me Mrs. Johnson instead of Clara, who moved with polished precision but no warmth. Daniel called it progress. To me, it felt like exile inside my own home. Sophia's transformation showed itself in whispers at glittering events. She invited me to a gala one evening, a fundraiser tied to her music career. I wore a black gown Richard had once loved, with pearls he gave me on our 10th anniversary. The moment I walked in, Sophia's smile faltered. She leaned close, whispering, "Mom, next time, let me hire someone to dress you. People notice these things." Her words pricked sharper than any pin. I smoothed the fabric, suddenly conscious of how plain I looked among sequins and diamonds. During the evening, she steered me away from the photographers, guiding me toward quieter corners. At dinner, she seated me near the back, murmuring, "It's cozier here." But I could see the main tables, the ones filled with donors and industry names. Each time someone asked about me, Sophia's answers were quick, dismissive. "This is my mother." Then she'd pivot the conversation to herself, her projects, her fiancé. Watching her laugh easily with her peers while I sat in the shadows, I felt invisible, as if I were an artifact in a room full of exhibits she actually wanted to display. Eric's change hurt in a different way. He had always been my boy with the open heart, the one who shared sandwiches with kids who had none, the one who swore he'd make life better for others. But Tanya's voice grew louder in his life, and soon his words no longer sounded like his own. I told him one evening about a charity I still supported, meals and tutoring for children in the neighborhood where I once scrubbed offices at dawn. I spoke with pride, remembering what those programs meant when I had nothing. Eric listened, then shrugged. "That's nice, Mom, but it's kind of a poverty mindset." The phrase hit me like a slap. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Handouts keep people dependent," he said, parroting ideas I knew didn't belong to him. "Tanya's been showing me how real change happens. It's about wealth creation, not scraps." Scraps. The word stuck in my chest like glass. I thought of the nights I turned scraps into meals to keep him alive. The silence between us was heavier than any argument could be. Piece by piece, the distance grew. At family dinners, I became background noise. Daniel corrected my speech, Sophia guided me to corners, Eric nodded distractedly while Tanya filled the air with her critiques. She had a way of surveying my home, as if it were a project waiting for her approval. "You should paint these walls lighter," she said once, sipping wine. "Soft white photographs better." I smiled politely, but inside I crumbled. I had spent weeks swallowing my hurt, convincing myself the distance was temporary. But one morning, as I stood in the kitchen polishing Richard's old watch, I realized silence was killing me more than their words ever could. I needed to face them, so I called each of my children. Sunday, at the house, no excuses. Daniel groaned about deadlines. Sophia murmured about rehearsals. Eric hesitated with Tanya's voice faint in the background. But I didn't budge. "You'll be here," I said, and they came. The table was set the way Richard loved it. Candles, linen runner, the photograph of him watching from the sideboard. I wanted them to feel his presence, to remember the man who had built our family's foundation. Daniel arrived first, in a pressed suit though it was Sunday, his eyes already elsewhere. Sophia swept in with her fiancé, radiant but distracted. Eric followed with Tanya on his arm, her gaze scanning my home as if she were already rearranging it. We sat. The silence between us hummed like a live wire. "I called you here," I began, gripping my hands together, "because I need you to remember who you are, who your father raised you to be." Daniel exhaled, impatient. "Mom, if this is about staff again." "It's not about staff," I cut in. "It's about values. Your father lived with integrity, with compassion. He believed wealth was a tool, not a weapon. I worked myself raw so you could stand tall, but lately, all I see is pride and distance. Sophia gave a tight smile, bracelets jingling as she waved her hand. Mom, times are different now. The world doesn't run on casseroles and charity anymore. You can't expect us to live like it's still Dad's era. Her words pierced me. Compassion doesn't expire, Sophia. Kindness isn't outdated. Daniel laughed lightly, shaking his head. Mom, listen to yourself. You sound naive. We're building legacies, businesses, reputations. You wouldn't understand. Wouldn't understand. My voice cracked. I built everything you have. I carried this family when Richard died. I bled for this life, and now you look at me as if I'm holding you back. Eric shifted in his chair, eyes flicking to Tanya. Before he could speak, she leaned forward, her tone silky. With respect, Mrs. Johnson, maybe they're right. Eric's stepping into bigger arenas. You clinging to these old ideas. Charity, giving back, that small thinking, poverty mindset. Her words echoed the very poison I'd once heard from Eric's lips, and my chest tightened. I turned to him, pleading. Eric, don't let her rewrite what you know is true. But he stayed silent, his jaw clenched. That silence said more than words. I looked at all three of them, desperation rising. I trusted you with everything. $50 million, every ounce of my life's work. But if this is what wealth has done, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I need to reconsider the trusts, revisit my will. The room froze. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Sophia's smile faltered. Eric finally looked at me, a flicker of panic before Tanya's hand squeezed his arm. You wouldn't dare, Daniel said coldly. What would you do? Hoard it? Take it with you to the grave? Sophia leaned forward, her voice condescending. Mom, this is exactly why older generations shouldn't meddle in finances. You're emotional. You confuse legacy with control. Eric's voice was low, almost rehearsed. Maybe you don't believe in us after all. I stared at them, searching for the children who once clung to my hands, who promised to make me proud. Instead, I saw only strangers, calculating, defensive, united not by love but by ambition. And then it happened. The glance. A quick exchange between Daniel and Sophia, then to Eric. Silent, sharp, chilling. In that flicker I saw the truth. I was no longer their mother. I was an obstacle. My hands shook as I gripped the table. If you forget your father's values, you'll lose yourselves, I whispered. God help you. Daniel rose, buttoning his jacket with finality. We'll see, Mom. Sophia stood too, her fiancé guiding her as though she were royalty leaving a stage. Eric lingered for half a heartbeat, but Tanya's hand pulled him away. The door closed behind them, leaving only candlelight flickering against Richard's photograph. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt dangerous. From that night forward, I knew. In their eyes, I wasn't family anymore. I was a threat. I always thought betrayal would come quietly, creeping through shadows like doubt. I never imagined it would arrive in broad daylight, polished and merciless, carried on the lips of my own children. It began on a Wednesday morning. I was in the kitchen brewing coffee when I heard engines outside, multiple cars pulling into the drive. I looked out the window and saw them. Daniel stepping out first, flanked by two suited lawyers, Sophia in dark sunglasses beside her fiancé, Eric trailing behind, Tanya clutching his arm as if she were the one who owned the place. Behind them came security men I'd never seen before, and a locksmith carrying a heavy bag of tools. My stomach turned cold. They didn't knock. They walked in as if the house already belonged to them. Mom, Daniel said briskly, nodding but not smiling, we need to talk. I stared at the unfamiliar men filling my foyer. What is this? Why are strangers in my home? Correction, Daniel replied, his voice clipped. Our home. The words knocked the breath from me. What did you just say? Sophia removed her sunglasses slowly, her eyes hard. The mansion was transferred into the family trust, Mom. For tax purposes. You signed the documents, don't you remember? I felt the room tilt. Papers. Contracts. Daniel had placed in front of me with little red stickers where my pen should go. He had called it streamlining, estate planning, just a way to protect assets. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? He was my son, my lawyer. You told me it was paperwork to secure the inheritance. My voice shook, fury mixing with disbelief. It was, Daniel said calmly, and as trustees, we now hold legal control. You've been struggling, Mom, forgetfulness, emotional outbursts. It's time we step in before things get worse. Struggling? My knees weakened. You call grieving your father's memory and begging you to remember your values struggling? The lawyers shifted their papers, sliding one across the table toward me. The black ink swam in my vision. Petition for incompetence hearing. Restraining order requested. Sophia's fiancé spoke smoothly, as if delivering presentation. These measures aren't personal. They're necessary. Your well-being and the estate's stability require firm oversight. Eric wouldn't meet my eyes. Tanya, however, looked directly at me, her lips curved into the faintest smirk. It's really for the best. Modern families need structure. No offense, Mrs. Johnson, but you've been holding on to the past too tightly. It's time to let go. I turned to Eric, desperate. Son, tell me you don't believe this. Tell me you won't stand by while they tear your mother down. But he just swallowed hard, Tanya's hand gripping his arm like a leash. It's already decided, Mom. Already decided. 3 words that shattered the floor beneath me. I backed away from the papers, shaking my head. You're my children. My children. I built this with my bare hands, and now you're plotting to strip me of everything? Daniel's face was stone. We're protecting what you built from you. The air around me thickened, claustrophobic, heavy. The security men stood at attention, impassive, as if I were a trespasser in my own kitchen. I felt Richard's picture watching from the wall, his steady eyes cutting into me, and for the first time I wanted to look away. This isn't protection, I whispered. This is betrayal. Daniel didn't flinch. It's legal. The eviction came faster than I could comprehend. You'll have 30 minutes to gather your belongings, one of the lawyers announced, checking his watch as if I were a tenant behind on rent. 30 minutes. A lifetime of sacrifice condensed into half an hour. My body went numb, moving on instinct. I opened drawers, pulling out clothes with trembling hands. Shirts, skirts, sweaters. I didn't even know what I was choosing. I grabbed my medicine, sweeping bottles into a small bag. From the dresser, I lifted the jewelry box Richard had given me on our anniversary, its wood worn smooth by decades of touch. Inside lay his wedding band, my pearls, and the little locket that held his picture. In the living room, I reached for photo albums, thick with years of birthdays, graduations, and Christmas mornings. My fingers shook so badly the pages slipped, spilling memories onto the floor. I dropped to my knees, gathering them frantically, whispering apologies to faces frozen in time. Upstairs, I opened the closet where Richard's coat still hung. I pressed my face into it, inhaling the faint trace of him, knowing it would fade once I left these walls. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to stand. Downstairs, Tanya followed me, her heels clicking like a metronome of cruelty. You really should have updated this place years ago, she said casually, watching me clutch a box of photographs. All these old things, so sentimental. Once we modernize, it'll finally look like it belongs to this century. Her words sliced me deeper than the cold air. I wanted to scream, to strike back, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I carried the box past her, my dignity trembling but intact. Sophia stood near the door, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Eric avoided my gaze, busying himself with Tanya's whispers. Daniel checked his watch again. Time's up, he said. I froze, looking at each of them in turn. My children. My blood. The babies I had nursed. The hands I had held through fevers and nightmares. The dreams I had fed with my sacrifices. They stood united now, not as family but as executioners. The locksmith finished his work with a metallic click. The locks were changed, my keys already worthless. Daniel picked up my final bag and set it at my feet. His eyes, once full of promise, now held only distance. And then I whispered, trembling, "Have you forgotten I'm your mother?" His reply was cold, merciless, joined by Sophia's icy tone and Eric's silence. We don't need you anymore, woman, Daniel said flatly. Sophia's voice cut in like glass. We have all your money already. The words struck harder than the rain pounding against my skin. I stepped out into the night. Rain poured down, soaking my hair, my clothes, the suitcase clutched against my chest. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a final echoing thud. The house, the dream I had built from nothing, was no longer mine. The rain didn't stop. It came down in sheets, stinging my skin, plastering my hair to my face. My suitcase grew heavier with each step until it felt like I was dragging not just clothes and photographs, but every sacrifice I had ever made. I walked without knowing where I was going, only that I couldn't stand still. Behind me, the house that had once held our laughter, loomed like a stranger's fortress, its windows glowing with light I was no longer allowed to touch. I thought of Richard, of the nights we had dreamed together about giving our children more than we had ever known. I thought of the hours in kitchens, the sleepless nights, the endless prayers. And now, all of it had been twisted, turned against me by the very hands I had raised. My children had thrown me into the storm. My legs trembled, my chest burned, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the roadside. But then, through the curtain of rain, I saw headlights slowing, pulling up beside me. A car door opened, and a voice cut through the storm. "Miss Johnson? Clara?" I blinked, squinting through the downpour. A tall man rushed toward me, an umbrella snapping open above us. His face came into view, older now but unmistakable. Marcus Hill. "Marcus?" My voice cracked. He nodded quickly, his eyes wide with concern. "It's me. Lord have mercy, what are you doing out here? You're soaked to the bone." Before I could answer, he lifted my suitcase with one arm and guided me to the car. His wife, Lillian, sat in the passenger seat, her hands pressed to her chest when she saw me. "Oh, Clara," she gasped. Come, get her warm." I slid into the back seat, back shivering uncontrollably, my heart thudding in disbelief. Marcus. The boy I once mentored at the diner when he was a scrawny teenager bussing tables. I had taught him how to balance trays, how to count change, how to look people in the eye and speak with respect. He had gone on to start his own small business, then another, building a steady life with Lillian at his side. And now here he was, catching me as I fell. Back at their home, Lillian wrapped me in blankets and pressed a steaming cup of tea into my hands. Marcus set my suitcase down gently in the corner, as though handling something sacred. The warmth of their house seeped into me, chasing away the chill, though not the ache in my chest. "You don't have to tell us everything right now," Lillian said softly, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Just know you're safe here. You're not alone." Her kindness cracked something open in me. The tears came, hot and relentless, spilling faster than the storm outside. For the first time, I let myself weep, not silently, not behind closed doors, but openly, my body shaking with the weight of loss. Marcus and Lillian sat with me, saying nothing, simply holding the space as if their presence alone could stitch the torn fabric of my heart. When my sobs finally quieted, Marcus spoke. "You gave me my first shot, Clara. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Everything I have now started because of you. Whatever's happened, you've still got family. You've got us." His words lit a fragile ember inside me. My children had turned away, yes, but love hadn't left me. Loyalty hadn't left me. Family wasn't always blood, it was those who showed up in the storm. That night, lying on a borrowed bed in their guest room, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain ease into a drizzle. My heart was heavy, but my mind began to turn. I thought about the trust, the house, the lawyers, about the coldness in Daniel's voice, the dismissal in Sophia's eyes, the silence in Eric's. They believed they had won. They believed they had stripped me of everything. But then, like a spark, a memory surfaced. A forgotten investment. Something small I had tucked away years ago when the restaurants were still thriving. Back then, Daniel had dismissed it as insignificant, not worth mentioning. But I had insisted, quietly, that it remain mine alone. Lying there in the dark, I felt a new kind of fire kindle in my chest. They thought they had taken it all, but they hadn't. And if that investment had grown the way I suspected, then I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I closed my eyes, clutching Richard's locket in my hand. "You see this, don't you?" I whispered into the silence. "They think they've broken me, but I'm not done. Not yet." The storm outside faded into silence, and with it came clarity. My children had chosen greed. They had cast me out, slammed the door, locked me away from the very life I had built. But their betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs and of mine. I turned on my side, pulling the blanket close, a fierce resolve settling into my bones. They may have the mansion, they may have the trusts, but they don't know what's coming. I will rise again, and when I do, they will remember who I am. "They think they've won," I whispered, a defiant smile tugging at my lips. "But they have no idea what's coming."